I'll think of an example from the material for this course, but the example I'm going to give you comes from a story that you quite possibly have read in past classes. I teach it in my Intro to Lit class. It's a story titled The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Gilman. It's a very short story. Very, very good. She wrote it at the beginning of the 20th century. It's about a woman whose husband is worried about her emotional well-being and who, under the advice of her doctor, uh, takes her to kind of a remote house that she thinks is a vacation house, and she's going to stay in the children's room. And she thinks it must have been a gymnasium for the children because there's evidence of things having been screwed into the floor and for bars to have put on the windows. And we realized later it was designed not for recreation but to hold someone in case she goes completely off her proverbial rocker. And the story is the story of how being isolated from other people, having no outlet for creative expression, not being able to write, not being able to keep her diary, not being able to talk to people, slowly that isolation plunges her into a complete psychotic break. It's a very good story. It's been an important story in the history of American lit. It's an important story in the history of writing by women. The criticism around it has been important to feminist literary criticism. But Charlotte Perkins Gilman wrote that story with a purpose. You see, that cure that the character undergoes, called the REST, R-E-S-T cure, which I believe was crafted and promulgated by a doctor named Silas Weir, W-E-I-R, Mitchell, was an actual cure given to women with nervous conditions in the early 20th century, and it mandated complete and absolute rest. No physical exertion, little to no contact with people, no conversation, no writing, no painting, no nothing. You've got to rest and keep the body perfectly rested in order for the mind to heal. Well, of course, what that lack of stimulation does to the human brain is, you know what the brain does, by the way, in the absence of stimulation? This is a nice experimental psychology thing. If you go into one of those things, sensory deprivation tank, so that you don't hear anything, smell anything, see anything, taste anything, or eventually feel tactile sensations, you know what your brain does? In the absence of stimuli, it starts to manufacture it. You begin to hallucinate and see things that aren't there, and hear things that aren't there, and smell things that aren't there, touch and taste things that aren't there. In the absence of sensory stimulation, the brain manufactures it. Well, she has a psychotic break in the story, and Charlotte Perkins Gilman was made to undergo the rest cure, and she recognized it as being unbelievably harmful, and she wrote that story specifically to expose the rest cure as the unhealthy, dangerous, threatening thing that it was. She name checks Silas Weir Mitchell in it. She calls it the rest cure. And by the end of that story, all of us who read it should be saying, this is messed up. You can't do this sort of thing. It doesn't work. It's just, you can't. Well, that's an interesting biographical historical detail, right? This is where biography and intent come together. But do you have to know that she underwent the rest cure in order to appreciate the story? Should you have to know that she wrote it as kind of a literary expose to reveal to the reading public the dangers of the harm caused by the rest cure? Well, the New Critic said, no, you shouldn't have to. Otherwise, art has just extremely limited value. So let's go back, if this makes sense, to the discussion question. Yeats's poetry, and especially Eliot's poetry, and a lot of modernist poetry, and a lot of modernist art, is dense with references as they refer to what came before and their take vision criticism of it. What happens when you don't get the references? Well, in pop culture, you watch 73 Easter eggs that you might have missed when you watched episode 4 of the Falcon and Bucky show. In literary history, if you're T.S. Eliot, you publish another version of your poem with a massive number of footnotes. This is, of course, in the history of a specific period in British literature. But we can study the history while still thinking about value, the worth of art. So I think it's worth your thinking. Do these works of art have any value beyond their status as historical artifacts? 200 years from now, are these going to be taught in anything other than histories of British lit? I mean, I'm not going to give you an answer one way or another, but when I teach Introduction to Literature, and we do a unit on poetry and a unit on fiction and a unit on drama, I don't pick that gives us, because I do another unit, 4 weeks to do each of those genres. Do I have time in 4 weeks to do The Wasteland? We don't have time in this course to explore all the references in The Wasteland. We have to talk about them in terms of how it makes modernist poetry different from Romantic or Victorian poetry. Better to pick something that isn't so heavy laden with references, right? So you can hand it to your Oakton Community College students of English 115 and say, okay, you read it, what do you think? There's something to think about.